Prohibition Partners TV with Lindsay Hooper.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Prohibition Partners Live. This is one of the pre-interviews we do before the show to just illustrate some of the great speakers that we've got. I'm filling in for Lindsay Hooper today. My name's Ralph Cochrane, and I'm delighted to welcome Steve DeAngelo, who is the Chairman Emeritus and co-founder of Harborside, Inc. And some people call him the father of the legal cannabis industry. So Steve, welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Ralph. Great to be here.
So I want to dive into your, what some people are saying about you. Can you just tell us a little bit about your connection with the cannabis industry?
Sure. I fell in love with the cannabis plant as a young teenager and decided to make legalizing cannabis my life's mission because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life living as a criminal. The first part of my career was just spent as a basic community organizer, street activist, putting on demonstrations. But over time, I developed a niche in creating legal cannabis businesses that allowed me to spread the message about cannabis and provide for my family at the same time. The most notable ones were Harborside, which was one of the first 6 cannabis businesses licensed in the United States. That happened in 2006. And then I went on to found the first dedicated cannabis laboratory, Steep Hill Laboratory, and the first cannabis investment firm, the ArcView Group. So for all of those reasons, Mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, called me the father of the legal cannabis industry.
Just listening to your story there, so I'm familiar with Silicon Valley and I guess the tech movement in San Francisco. What time period has your journey been over, and what kind of things have you seen that I guess looking back you think, wow, that was a real game changer?
Most of my career was spent on the East Coast. I didn't come to California until around 2001. And 2006 is when I was granted the license for Harborside. But the events that really led to all of this started in San Francisco at the height of the AIDS crisis in the late 1980s, when my good friend, a guy named Dennis Perrone, started distributing cannabis to AIDS patients because we had noticed that AIDS patients who consumed cannabis were living longer and having a better quality of life. And that was really the genesis of the medical cannabis movement that has now swept the globe.
I mean, talking about legislation in the US, you're ahead certainly of where I am in the UK. Will cannabis legislation be discussed during the 2020 presidential election, do you think?
It's not going to be a terribly important topic of conversation, given that Joe Biden has now become the de facto nominee for the Democratic Party. If Bernie Sanders had been the nominee, then we would be having a very robust debate about cannabis. Unfortunately, Joe Biden has been a cannabis prohibitionist for most of his career. He's now attempting to walk back some of that position to appeal to the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But sadly, what I anticipate for the next 4 years is that whichever of the parties wins the next presidential election, neither one of them is going to be interested in moving cannabis reform at the federal level forward in any meaningful way.
I mean, what lessons do you think the rest of the world can learn from what you've already done in the US with cannabis, both in terms of legislation, but also, I guess, investment, marketing? I mean, there's such a movement there that we have yet to see, certainly in the UK and most of Europe.
Well, I think there were 2 things that happened in the United States and North America that really made things quite different. First, there was a very dedicated, persistent, relentless grassroots movement of cannabis activists, people who engaged in the kind of direct action that I described, my friend Dennis Perrone, just giving cannabis to AIDS patients. That was a movement that started in the early 1970s and is continuing to this day. There's not really anything comparable that I've seen in Europe in terms of the breadth or the power of that grassroots movement. The second factor has been the marriage of free enterprise and cannabis. This happened really in over the course of the last 10 years. We've been able to create legal cannabis businesses. And so now a lot of the energy that's powering the change in the United States is also coming from people who have seen the economic opportunity in cannabis. And it's this combination of a strong grassroots movement and then a cannabis-powered industry that's really made the difference here.
When you look at that ecosystem and market that's developing, what gets you excited at the moment?
Well, what gets me excited at the moment is what I'm seeing happening all over the world. I spent 200 days on the road last year, and what I saw was that the spark that we lit in California has now spread to, I visited 4 different continents, and it was in full evidence in all of those continents. So I think that that's what's most exciting, is that we now have taken this movement to a point where there's literally dozens of countries around the world that have reformed their cannabis laws. Many more are considering reforming their cannabis laws. And I think what that means really is that this movement is unstoppable now.
I mean, it certainly seems to be growing very quickly. I've read about something called the Last Prisoner Project that you're involved in. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
The Last Prisoner Project is a nonprofit advocacy group that I founded about a year ago. And its purpose is single-minded. We want to ensure that every single cannabis prisoner on planet Earth is released and has an opportunity to rebuild their lives. This is, for me, it's just a basic moral imperative. If we are going to build a legal cannabis industry, then we need to make sure that the people who were unjustly arrested before the cannabis industry was legal are released. And so that's what we are about doing. That work has become much more urgent with the COVID crisis, of course.
I was going to ask you, what impact do you think the COVID crisis has had on the industry and also initiatives like the Last Prisoner Project?
So on the industry, it's really been, for the most part in the United States, a very positive impact, because most states, most jurisdictions have declared cannabis an essential business and allowed it to remain open when most other businesses were closed. So our employees have continued to receive paychecks. Our businesses continue to have revenue. And in fact, we saw a significant uptick in sales in the first 4 weeks of the quarantine period. That's leveled off a bit now, but sales continue to be strong. So the cannabis industry is doing well. It's an entirely different picture for cannabis prisoners. I'm really sad to report that just last week we lost one of our constituents who had been imprisoned in Missouri for 10 years on a charge of cultivating cannabis. The judge who sentenced him, when he sentenced him, a medical cannabis law had already been passed in that state, and he knew that our constituent had cancer and still sentenced him to 10 years in prison for cultivating this healing plant. So unfortunately, the prisons in the United States have become the world's highest concentration of COVID locations. In the federal prison system, 70% of all prisoners who have been tested have tested positive for COVID. So it's a life and death situation for our constituents now.
I mean, those figures are pretty sobering. Is the work that you're doing focused mainly on the US, or is it kind of worldwide? And what are you seeing elsewhere as well?
Our work so far has been focused on the U.S. We're a new organization. We have a staff of 2, and we're really taking the lowest hanging fruit first. But the vision for the organization is global, and we've begun to develop relationships in Canada, in Jamaica, in Colombia, in Mexico, with individuals and organizations who will help us become active all around the world. In our view, it's absolutely necessary that as a legal cannabis industry is built all around the world, it's creating intergenerational wealth, already has created some billionaires, that we can't leave these cannabis prisoners behind. So the vision is global, and we're moving in that direction as quickly as we can.
Well, I wish you the best of luck with that, Steve. And just to close, as you know, this year, Prohibition Partners Live is going to be a virtual event online because of the issues that everybody's facing. But in a way, it also offers the opportunity to use the technology to meet the right people at the event. So there'll be some very clever matchmaking technology in use at the event. And I just wondered, who are you looking to meet at Prohibition Partners Live this year?
Well, my main interest is going to be meeting people from around the world who are interested in moving the Last Prisoner project forward and creating beachheads for the organization around the world. That will be my number one priority. A secondary priority is going to be developing correspondence for my own podcast, which we expect to launch sometime in the next quarter.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thanks for talking to us. We're looking forward to seeing you at the event. And for everybody watching this, don't forget that there are still some early bird tickets available. That's prohibitionpartners.live. But that's all from me, Ralph Cochrane. And next time, Lindsay will be back.
Be part of the conversation at Prohibition Partners Live, 22nd to 23rd of June, the premium online cannabis industry conference.